these numbers are only according to the official Pentagon budget, but we all know that the Pentagon spends much more. And in fact, at the bottom of the article, I linked to a report that shows that the Pentagon has failed every single audit it has ever done. And the Pentagon has tens of trillions of dollars of unaccounted spending. So, I mean, we don't know how much the military actually spends. And if you go up to the other graph, it shows you, just according to the official military budget, U.S. military spending versus the next 9 largest military spenders combined. And keep in mind, many of those are allies. India is an ally, and it's part of the Quad, which is the anti-China NATO. The UK is obviously an ally. It's like the little running dog of the U.S. empire.
Yeah.
France and Germany and Saudi Arabia and Japan and South Korea are all U.S. allies. So the only countries on there that are not U.S. allies are China and Russia. But all the other countries, if you combine their military spending, it's half of what the U.S. spends.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. With the U.S. hyper-focused on Russia and China, it's easy to forget that this overstretched empire is still up to its old tricks in the rest of the global south, continuing to destabilize, plot coups, and steal resources. What does that insatiable imperialist appetite mean for the resource-rich countries of Latin America? What Trump called our backyard and Biden upgraded to America's front yard. After all, that copper, gold, zinc, silver, lead, iron, and natural gas in Peru, the lithium in Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, and the oil in Venezuela isn't going to steal itself. And how is this new Cold War with Russia and China playing out throughout the region as the U.S. dusts off the so-called Monroe Doctrine? As Pink Tide 2.0 sweeps Latin America, what's the U.S. backlash? And how can this new multipolar era benefit the forces of independence and sovereignty? Here to discuss this and more is Ben Norton, a Latin America-based journalist and founder of the Geopolitical Economy Report. But before we jump into it, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can help it grow by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthroughnews. Or you can donate below on YouTube. Ben, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Ronnie. It's always a real pleasure being on Breakthrough. You all do amazing work.
Well, you're doing great work at your incredible outlet, the Geopolitical Economy Report, which of course I will make sure to link to all of the stuff that we're going to talk about because you've been covering at your website. But I wanted to draw attention to a video you actually told me about. Basically, we're going to obviously delve into Latin America, how the U.S. has continued to go about, its various schemes to try and steal resources because Latin America is full of them. And I wanted to start with this video, which of course Kasaucha News tweeted out. And this is, just to give some background here, this was a interview with the Atlantic Council, and the woman speaking is the U.S. Southcom commander. Her name is General Laura Richardson, and she's basically talking about Latin America's natural resources, and I'll go ahead and let it speak for itself and then get your reaction.
This region, why this region matters with all of its rich resources and rare earth elements. You've got the lithium triangle, which is needed for technology today. 60% of the world's lithium is in the lithium triangle: Argentina, Bolivia, Chile. You just have the largest oil reserves, light sweet crude, discovered off of Guyana over a year ago. You have Venezuela's resources as well with oil, copper, gold. China gets 36% of its food source from this region. We have the Amazon, lungs of the world. We have 31% of the world's fresh water in this region too. It's just off the charts. But then when you talk about trade is unbelievable. The trade in the region, I talked about all the ties that we have with this hemisphere. But the PRC and a lot of our countries in this region is the number one trade partner with the United States number 2 in most cases, not in most cases, I would say in some cases. However, to see the increase in investment and trade from 2002 from China, 18 billion, up to 450 billion now, and on its way, what is predicted to be about 750 billion in the near future. And so I think we have a lot at stake.
So I want to just get your reaction to that video to kind of set the stage for a lot of what we're going to discuss about ongoing U.S. efforts to continue to essentially steal Latin America's resources. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, it's not too surprising for people who know about the history of coups that the U.S. has organized around the world. But I mean, hearing it so blatantly is very constructive, especially at the Atlantic Council, which is NATO's de facto think tank funded by the arms industry. At the beginning of that interview, they actually show, they say this series is sponsored by Saab, the weapons corporation. So, I mean, it just says everything about how politics actually is made and how it's driven by corporate interests. And she says it all very clearly. Latin America is one of the most resource-rich regions of the world. You, Rania, have been doing great work. You and Eugene Puryear, I saw, did an excellent interview with a journalist talking about cobalt in Congo. And of course, people know that Africa also is an extremely rich region in natural resources, and that Western corporations have been exploiting those resources. And it's the same story in Latin America. You know, they say that the continent has been both blessed and cursed with these natural resources. We can talk about the 1973 coup, famously against Salvador Allende in Chile. And people probably know that the people of Chile they democratically elected a socialist, Allende, and he nationalized the reasserted national control over the copper. Chile is the world's largest producer of copper, and copper is extremely important for all kinds of technologies, and increasingly so. In fact, Goldman Sachs, one of the world's largest investment banks, referred to copper as the new oil. And they said there's going to be a new campaign to control copper around the world. And the largest producer of copper is Chile. And the second largest producer of copper is Peru. And that's going to be a topic we'll talk about today. Also, we know that Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, but not just Venezuela. Brazil is a significant oil producer. Even Colombia and Ecuador have significant oil reserves. Lithium, which is increasingly important around the world. Lithium has been referred to as the white gold, and it's needed for batteries in electric cars and phones and computers. And the world's largest lithium reserves are in Bolivia, and over 2/3 of the entire global lithium supply, at least known global lithium supply, is in the lithium triangle, which the Southcom commander, Lara Richardson, mentioned, which consists of Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. And we've seen that, in fact, in Peru, which also has lithium reserves, 2 months before the US-backed coup against the elected president Pedro Castillo, left-wing lawmakers who supported Castillo's government introduced legislation to nationalize Peru's lithium reserves. By the way, Mexico, under its progressive president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, they actually have done that. The López Obrador government last year nationalized lithium and renationalized all oil because Mexico is a significant oil producer. And Mexico, after the Mexican Revolution, which happened between 1910 and 1920, they created a new progressive constitution that said that Mexico's natural resources belong to the people. And then they eventually created a state-owned oil company. And that was partially privatized by the neoliberal governments in Mexico, especially under President Enrique Peña Nieto. So López Obrador, he renationalized the oil and also the lithium. So we see across Latin America a clear trend toward trying to nationalize resources and then using the revenue from those resources to fund social programs and healthcare and education. And we know throughout history for many decades, the US has sponsored coups and backed dictatorships that impose those kinds of neoliberal reforms that privatize those natural resources. So hearing it from the mouth of not a politician, but from the commander of the part of the US military that oversees operations in South America is extremely revealing. Again, I want to stress this point. We're not listening to someone from the Treasury. We're not listening to someone from the Department of Energy. We're listening to someone from the Pentagon. And she's making it clear that the Pentagon knows what its real job is. It's to maintain control over trade routes and natural resources.
Exactly. And before we get into some more specifics about Peru in particular, which you wrote a really excellent piece about, I was wondering, Ben, if you could talk a little bit about the Monroe Doctrine, because I think it's really important in the context of Latin America. And of course, you had, when Donald Trump was president, his administration actually invoked the Monroe Doctrine when it came to Latin America. He even called Latin America, he wasn't the first to do this, but he called it our backyard. Now, then Biden becomes president and refers to Latin America. I think he upgraded it, right, to calling it the front yard, America's front yard.
Yeah.
But more importantly, what is the significance or importance of the Monroe Doctrine, which seems like something very old, but is very much relevant today?
Yeah, this year, this is a perfect year to ask that question. This year is the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, which goes back to 1823. And it's associated with President James Monroe, although he didn't actually write it. But the point is that the Monroe Doctrine was the U.S. government's declaration that Latin America and the Caribbean is its colonial sphere of influence. And what's less known about this history is that the U.S. actually tried to portray the Monroe Doctrine as something like positive for the region. And when we hear it invoked today, when we hear specifically U.S. politicians and officials like Laura Richardson, the commander of Southcom, they constantly talk about the so-called threat of China and Russia in Latin America. And in that interview that she did on January 19th at the Atlantic Council, she refers to it as our neighborhood. So they understand that saying our backyard is very colonial and arrogant. So now they've upgraded it to saying our neighborhood. But everyone knows that when they say our neighborhood, they mean we control this neighborhood. And in that interview that she did, where she talks about the natural resources, she continuously fearmongers about China's and Russia's relations with countries in the region. In fact, in that same video, she complains that 9 countries in Latin America have bought Russian military equipment. And she says that the U.S. wants to take that Russian military equipment from them and donate it to Ukraine, and then those countries can replace it with U.S. military equipment. She says it very clearly in the interview. And in fact, the new Colombian left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, he spoke about that at the meeting of the CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, and he criticized the U.S. for that. And he said, we're not going to be giving you our Russian military equipment to send to Ukraine. We're not going to do that. Also, President Lula in Brazil said the same, and President Alberto Fernandez in Argentina said the same. So the point is that rhetoric where the U.S. claims that China and Russia are supposedly threats in our neighborhood is the same kind of attitude of the Monroe Doctrine, because back in the 1820s, the U.S. was saying to the newly independent countries in Latin America that overthrew Spanish colonialism, was saying to Europe that these countries in Latin America are part of our sphere of influence, and the U.S. is not going to tolerate European colonial powers meddling in the region. So it was portrayed ostensibly in that time as a critique of European colonialism, but it was actually an assertion of U.S. imperialism. And we see that same kind of rhetoric today, but instead of European colonialists, it's the U.S. saying Latin America is our sphere of influence. Russia and China cannot be involved in the region. So in many ways, the invocation of the Monroe Doctrine today, directly in the case of the Trump administration or indirectly in the case of people like Laura Richardson, it's exactly the same kind of colonial ideology that says that this is the property of the United States. And in the case of the Trump administration, I mean, Rex Tillerson, who, let's not forget, he was Trump's first Secretary of State, but he was from Exxon. He is an oil executive, and he was the one who began invoking openly the Monroe Doctrine, and specifically in regard to Venezuela, even before Trump tried this ridiculous coup stunt with Juan Guaido. That was Mike Pompeo who was involved in that as Secretary of State. But back when Rex Tillerson was Secretary of State, he was talking about how Venezuela is a threat and it has all these huge oil reserves, and they've kicked out all of the private companies like Exxon, the company where he worked before becoming Secretary of State. And then what happened after is, of course, Mike Pompeo, former CIA director, in scare quotes, turned Secretary of State, which shows how the CIA and the State Department are basically joined at the hip. And then he comes in, and then National Security Advisor John Bolton comes in, the arch neocon. And then he also invokes the Monroe Doctrine. And specifically, he says it in the context of Russia providing military support to Venezuela, which people might forget. But at the peak of the coup attempt in 2019, the U.S. was talking about doing a naval blockade of Venezuela. That is, sending the U.S. Navy off the coast of Venezuela and preventing Venezuela from exporting anything, which would be setting the stage for a military invasion. And we know, according to John Bolton's book, and we know, according to Trump's former defense secretary, Mark Esper, who also, by the way, was a Raytheon executive. I mean, all of these ministers, these secretaries in the U.S. cabinet, they all have a revolving door with big corporations, which again shows who really is in charge here. But Mark Esper and John Bolton wrote in their memoirs that Trump repeatedly proposed invading Venezuela. I mean, Trump was not in any way anti-war. He was, in fact, more hawkish than some other people around him, including some of the generals.
Yeah.
And of course, it's in Mark Esper's interest to portray Trump as crazier than he is, and the Pentagon is more level-headed. But anyway, the point is that we know that they were proposing invading Venezuela, and then what happened is Russia sent planes to Venezuela, and that was clear. And they obviously did this with the consent of the Venezuelan government. Venezuela probably asked them, but that was a sign. I mean, I'm not saying that's like Russian imperialism. I'm saying that Venezuela and Russia have a strategic alliance, and Venezuela asked for Russian support to prevent a U.S. military invasion, because by doing that, the U.S. could see that if they invaded Venezuela, Russia could potentially get drawn into a conflict and it could escalate, right? So, I mean, the point is that when we see the invocation of the Monroe Doctrine today, it is in exactly the same kind of neo-colonial context. They're telling Latin America, you cannot have sovereign relations with China and Russia, despite the fact that you want to boost your relations with them. You want Russian military assistance. You want Chinese commercial assistance, loans, trade deals. No, the U.S. is saying that's not tolerable. And in that sense, when Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump and Rex Tillerson and John Bolton, when they invoked the Monroe Doctrine, and all of them did so, it's exactly the same kind of colonial ideology that they're talking about today. They were talking about 200 years ago.
And of course, like you basically broke down, I mean, this has a lot to do with the need to be able to access really important resources on the cheap, or in some cases practically for free. And that brings us to, you laid some of the groundwork for the idea of what's happening in Peru in terms of what Peru can offer the world and its natural resources. But also, I mean, this comes at a time when, after Peru had elected a left-wing leader, there's been this coup in the country. There's been so much violence in response to protesters demanding that the coup be undone, essentially. And meanwhile, you have, as you wrote about here for your outlet, the Geopolitical Economy Report, you have the CIA-linked U.S. ambassador meeting with mining and energy ministers to discuss, quote, investments, right? And you note in the subheading here that Peru has the largest reserves of copper, gold, zinc, silver, lead, iron, and natural gas. And then after that coup that overthrew the left-wing president, there was this meeting between this U.S. ambassador, as you mentioned, Lisa Kenna, with the mining and energy ministers of this new coup government to discuss all these things. And this also comes at a time when Europe is desperate for any LNG gas supply to replace Russian energy sources. And so that includes trying to import that of Peru. So can you talk a bit about the significance of what's taking place in Peru right now in relation to everything else you mentioned?
Absolutely. Well, people who don't know about the coup, I'll briefly explain the history. So in 2021, the people of Peru voted, democratically elected, a left-wing president, Pedro Castillo, who is a rural peasant and a teacher, and he represents the majority indigenous descent Peruvian population who have been excluded from politics. He became well known because he was a teacher in a rural area and also a farmer, and he was leading a teacher's strike across the country. And he became well known for carrying around this big pencil, right? And that became his symbol during his presidential campaign as someone representing the working class, the union movement, and especially peasants in rural areas of indigenous descent. And he won the election. Very few people thought he would win, but he actually managed to win. And the other candidate in the second round was a far-right politician who is the daughter of Peru's former dictator, Alberto Fujimori, and her name is Keiko Fujimori. And she leads this far-right fascistic party in Peru, and they're known as the Fujimoristas. So he won the election, and during his campaign, one of his main promises was that Castillo would try to nationalize and assert control over Peru's natural resources. So Peru is the world's second largest producer of copper, which again, Goldman Sachs referred to as the new oil. And Peru is also a producer of natural gas. And in fact, it's one of the largest producers in Latin America and the Caribbean, along with Trinidad and Tobago. I'll talk about that in a second. It's a very significant producer of gold. Obviously, we know how valuable gold is, but also it has zinc, it has iron. So it has a lot of natural resources and especially minerals. And in fact, over half of Peru's exports, around 60%, come from mineral exports. So a huge part of the Peruvian economy relies on the mining sector. And in Peru, the world's three largest mining corporations are very active and have a lot of investments, including BHP, Glencore, and Rio Tinto. And those are Australian, British, and Swiss companies. And I want to give people an understanding here. Peru is still a very poor country, especially rural areas, which have been really abandoned by the government for many years, for decades, with a series of neoliberal right-wing governments. And the Peruvian economy, the entire size of it measured in dollars, so nominal GDP, is around $220 billion. Just the Swiss company Glencore is nearly the same size. So it's a little over $200 billion in revenue every single year. So we're talking about massive transnational corporations that have huge economic and also political influence. In BHP and Rio Tinto, the other two biggest mining corporations, each have around $60 billion in revenue per year. So these are massive corporate monstrosities, and they have a chokehold on Peruvian politics. And there are a lot of local mining companies, but they're largely just owned by all of the transnational corporations, right? So saying that, there are these companies in Peru and they claim that they're national, but if you look at their shareholders, they're not actually national. So the point is that this is a country where it has massive mineral reserves, but that wealth does not go to benefit the Peruvian people. It goes to enrich these multinational corporations. So Pedro Castillo, when he came in, he said that he was going to try to reassert control. And specifically, he proposed, after winning the election, and when he came in, he said that what he was going to try to do is, as a step toward full nationalization, in the meantime, he was going to try to increase taxation and policies so that 70% of all of the proceeds of mining would go to the government. And then he said that he would use that money to fund education and healthcare and poverty reduction programs. I mean, it wasn't full nationalization, but that was a step toward it. And as I mentioned earlier, 2 months before he was overthrown, the members of Congress from the left who were loyal to his government, they proposed legislation that would have nationalization of the lithium, and following the Bolivian model. Bolivia has seen remarkable success after Evo Morales came in 2006, and he nationalized the lithium and other natural resources and used that to fund social programs. Peru wanted to follow the same model. And of course, Peru was collaborating with Bolivia. And also, by the way, Peru was collaborating with another neighbor, which is the new left-wing government in Colombia, of Gustavo Petro. And they were specifically working on gas production programs because Colombia also has gas. And they were working together on developing gas infrastructure. So at the same time, not only are we talking about part of an attempt to reassert control over natural resources, but all of this is linked to the growing attempt to unify Latin America and integrate the region. And I've talked about that a lot with the attempt to build a new currency called the Sur, but also there's forms of economic integration. We see now that Brazil has a new left-wing president, Lula da Silva. He's working with Argentina, and one of Brazil's state-owned banks is giving Argentina loans to develop an Argentine gas pipeline, because Argentina does have gas reserves, and they're going to send gas from Argentina to Brazil. So all of this is about integrating the region so they can help develop each other. And Peru was an important part of that. And now, since the coup, of course, we've seen a complete reversal. And the new coup regime has carried out extreme violence. Around 70 protesters have been killed since December in just 2 months. And also, it's been imposing neoliberal economic policies, of course, that always comes with these coups. And this brings me to this article that I wrote, and I can talk more about it maybe in a bit later, but the basic gist of it is that the U.S. ambassador in Peru, Lisa Kenna, is a CIA veteran. And, I wouldn't say former CIA official necessarily, because we all know there's no such thing as a former CIA agent.
It's a lifelong thing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So she also, I'm doing another report on this. You get a little sneak peek here. She also comes from a family of CIA operatives, not just her. And she works for the State Department now, at least officially on paper. And the Trump administration appointed her as ambassador to Peru. And one day before the coup against Pedro Castillo, she met with the Peruvian defense minister. And then on the day of the coup, he told the Peruvian military to disobey the orders of President Castillo. And then they later arrested him. And then now, since the coup, she's been meeting with a lot of people. I mean, with many. What's funny is because you see all these people, these ministers and ministries on Twitter, they always just post these photos because they're so proud. We met with the U.S. ambassador.
Yeah.
And then, specifically, the Ministry of Mining and Energy. It's one ministry. They met with the U.S. ambassador, and they had a discussion of expanding mining projects, expanding foreign investment in mining, and expanding gas exploration. So all of this is happening right out in the open. It's pretty blatant.
Yeah, it is. We know, from what's happened in other places, what all of that means. I think there's also another element here. I mean, when I showed that video in the beginning of the woman from Southcom, the general, she did refer to the amount that China is investing in Latin America. And then, as you discussed the Monroe Doctrine, you kind of, you made the parallel between, well, back then it was about telling European colonial powers that they can't mess with our backyard. And now, of course, it's about telling Russia and China, as we enter this new Cold War, we're in this new Cold War. We've already entered it, to tell them that, like, to stay out of our backyard. And so as this becomes an increasingly important, angle for the U.S. as far as the global South is concerned, with trying to combat Russia and China from having relations with these countries, you see these narratives emerging about much of what, similar to narratives that we've heard about China's role in other parts of the world, about Chinese debt traps in Latin America. I'm even going to show a few examples here. This is one example of, hang on, let me add it. This is this is from Congress. This was written by the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere Civilian Security and Trade, by the Committee of Foreign Affairs in the House of Representatives. And as you can see from the title, and of course for those who are listening, this is basically a 71-page document accusing China of doing all kinds of horrible things in the Western Hemisphere, basically in America's backyard. The title is Dollar Diplomacy or Debt Trap: Examining China's Role in the Western Hemisphere. And I mean, it just goes, on and on and on about all the horrible things China's doing. I mean, you can't really see it here. It's written in too small letters, but it's a very lengthy document. And you see similar sort of talking points appearing in the media more often and at think tanks. So here you have the Council of Foreign Relations. This is back last year, April of 2022. The title of this piece is China's Growing Influence in Latin America, and it warns that China has developed close economic and security ties with many Latin American countries, specifically noting Brazil and Venezuela. But Beijing's growing sway in the region has raised concerns in Washington and beyond. And then you have this piece that is much more recent, in appearing in Foreign Affairs just in January last month of 2023. The title is China's Latin America Power Play. And then it goes on to say, to counter Beijing, the West must invest in people. And I mean, this is kind of more of the mainstream stuff you're hearing. But I do want to draw attention to one more thing before I let you take it from here, Ben. And that is this, you're going to laugh once I say what it is. I'm just about to share it. But that is this. So Bolsonaro obviously lost the election in Brazil. But ahead of that election, you had Tucker Carlson going to Brazil to essentially campaign for Bolsonaro. And he was interviewing Bolsonaro. And of course, going around and promoting him against Lula. But something else he did is, this is a specific program he did while he was in Brazil called the China Takeover, Brazil. And I just want to play the clip of the promo because I think it kind of says it all. So
one quick, just for people before they listen to this here, he mentions the Monroe Doctrine in exactly the same context I was discussing.
Exactly. So I want people to pay close attention to that. But here is Tucker Carlson's promo for his special episode, the China Takeover, Brazil edition, while he was down in Brazil.
In 1823, President James Monroe announced a policy that has been the center of American foreign policy for the last 200 years. Called the Monroe Doctrine, it has a very simple thesis. Great powers would not be allowed to control nations in the Western Hemisphere. That would be a direct threat to the interests of the United States. And for 200 years, we haven't allowed it. Under the Biden administration, the Monroe Doctrine is no longer in force. Constrained by its ideological concerns, consumed with petty political grievances, and above all, distracted by a faraway war in Eastern Europe, the Biden administration has abdicated its responsibility. And into the void left by the United States moves a new superpower. We've come to Brazil to see for ourselves the rise of China and how the government of China is replacing the United States as the dominant power in our hemisphere.
So, anyways, I thought that was actually a really good sort of. It just puts everything I said into the actual narrative that's being pushed. Actually, that isn't so far from the mainstream. The only thing that was not so mainstream about that is that Tucker Carlson did that while he was in Brazil to promote Bolsonaro, which we of course know that sort of the mainstream liberals of the global north were against him at this point. But anyways, Ben, how do you react to this narrative about China and warning that, China is going to take over Latin America if we're not careful? There's debt trap diplomacy. China has nefarious goals that are really all about weakening America.
No, it's absolutely ridiculous. And it ignores how the relations that China enjoys with countries in the region are completely bilateral and consensual. These countries in the region, they want to boost their ties with China. One, it's the world's largest economic power, according to purchasing power parity measurement, but it's also, even according to nominal GDP, the second biggest, not only in terms of production, but it's also a massive market. Especially, China is a huge purchaser of agricultural products like soy, for instance, and countries like Argentina and Brazil produce a lot of soy. So, there is this kind of marriage of convenience, and it's mutually beneficial for both countries. And this has been referred to as South-South cooperation, right? It's good for both countries. Why should they not boost their collaboration? But the United States says that this is our backyard. And, I talked about the Monroe Doctrine, and it's very revealing to see Tucker Carlson invoke it in the same context I was talking about. But I should also add, he said that James Monroe articulated it, but actually it's not true. It was the speech originally that was developed by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. And today there's been this attempt to try to rehabilitate Quincy Adams, John Quincy Adams, and portray him as like an anti-interventionist. There's the Quincy Institute, and no disrespect to them. I mean, they sometimes do some good work there, but I'm against this attempt to try to rehabilitate John Quincy Adams as an anti-interventionist, because it shows that his whole concept of so-called anti-interventionism was, I'm against European colonialism, but I want to assert U.S. hegemony. He's the one who wrote the Monroe Doctrine. And it again shows this kind of sleight of hand, this political sleight of hand, where the U.S. says, oh, we're against empires. We're against Chinese so-called colonialism in Latin America, which is why we want to assert our colonialism on Latin America, right? So it's just turning the narrative exactly on its head. And if you look at the countries in the region that have good relations with China, look at what their leaders say. They constantly praise China for the assistance. And it's no surprise why. Not only do they have mutually beneficial economic relations, but consistently, China offers much favorable arrangements. Whether it's loans, China offers lower interest loans and forgives those loans, or is willing to renegotiate those loans. And it's not going to impose political conditionalities like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Or not to mention private banks in the United States. I mean, so frequently what happened, especially after in the 1970s, you have the oil crisis, and then you have these countries in Latin America that are net importers of oil and other commodities. They build up this massive debt, and then they took a lot of that debt with private banks in the United States, because you have this flush, you have this glut of US dollars in private commercial banks in the US because of the petrodollar system. So all of these Persian Gulf monarchies, they get paid because in 1974, the US government made this agreement with Saudi Arabia to sell oil in the dollar. And then what happens with all of those dollars that all the Gulf monarchies get from they selling their oil is they recycle those dollars back into private commercial banks in the US. And those commercial banks gave loans to countries, especially like Mexico and Brazil and Argentina. And then in the 1980s, after the US Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker, Volcker does a massive increase of interest rates, known as the Volcker shock. You have all of these countries in Latin America that are unable to pay their dollar-denominated debt, and they all default. And that gives to the rise of the IMF and the World Bank coming in and demanding their pound of flesh and imposing neoliberalism on the region. These people are not stupid. They remember the 1980s. It's not that long ago. They remember the brutal austerity measures that were imposed on the region, and that because that debt was held with the commercial banks, the IMF came in and said, okay, we will buy that debt, but then you have to pay us that debt back, and you have to impose all of these neoliberal structural adjustment conditionalities. China doesn't do that. I mean, it's the same thing in Africa. It's not a surprise why so many countries in Africa want to have better relations with China, because it's better. It's better for them in their interest. And that's not to mention, the infrastructure projects through the Belt and Road Initiative. We see that over a dozen countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have joined the Belt and Road Initiative. Cuba and Nicaragua recently joined. Argentina recently joined in February of 2022. And Argentina's president, Alberto Fernandez, took a trip to Beijing and Moscow, and he gave a speech saying that our country has been too dependent for too long on the IMF and the United States, and we are seeking new alternatives. Now Argentina and Brazil are developing a new international currency for trade that removes their use of the US dollar. China and Argentina, their central banks just signed a new agreement for a currency swap, which is a way of China providing liquidity for Argentina. And it's also a way of encouraging, what's another way to stabilize the currency, which has been facing a lot of inflation, devaluation because of the inflation. But also, it's a way for China and Argentina to encourage trading with each other with their own currencies, with the renminbi and the Argentine peso instead of using dollars. So the point is that if you look consistently at the countries around the region, China, and to a lesser extent Russia, because Russia's not as big of an economic power, but Russia does have very positive political relations with these countries, and Russia does provide military support to several countries, and to some countries, Russia does provide energy and wheat, and fertilizer, especially fertilizer, being one of the world's largest producers of fertilizer, especially in Brazil, because Brazil has a huge agricultural sector. So the point is that these countries, they have bilateral positive relations with China and Russia. And even if it's the private sector, for instance, there are private Chinese companies that are active. For instance, Bolivia the Bolivian government offered contracts to help with lithium exploration because, I mean, obviously Bolivia would like for all of its lithium industry to be state owned, but it doesn't have a lot of the human capital. It's very technologically intensive. It doesn't have all the technology. Mining is difficult work. You need trained workers, you need trained engineers, you need all the capital. And sometimes that means that you do have to have this foreign technology and foreign investors to provide you some of that, but you can still have a balance of state ownership and private investment. So Bolivia they offered contracts, and a Chinese company won the contracts to help lithium exploration. And it's not because China is controlling Bolivia, it's because the Chinese companies were willing to do the same work at better quality for less pay. I mean, it's no surprise. So even according to their own capitalist market logic, the United States is angry that China is winning and they're losing because their companies can't offer as good of a deal. So even from the perspective of state-to-state relations, and also from the perspective of foreign investment, China offers them a better deal. It's not because China is forcing them to do something they don't want to do.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that speaks to why you had even a country that was run by someone like Bolsonaro, who was actually rhetorically quite anti-China, still like on the books, the relations with China were great, trade relations were great, because at the end of the day, if you have something that's going to be mutually beneficial for your economy and China versus the kind of relationship that you have, I mean, at the end of the day, what it means is that China does not have an imperialist relationship with these countries. They can get more for themselves out of trade relations with China than they can with some US or Canadian mining company, which is essentially just stealing from them and leaving them with nothing to help develop their own countries. And I think this speaks to one of the reasons why, like, I think that the threat from Russia and China that the US feels is even a bigger deal than what the Monroe Doctrine era leaders perceived from European colonizers, because it's not just competition over who gets to steal these resources, but Russia and China, because they don't have an imperialist relationship with these countries in Latin America, they offer space for forces of sovereignty and independence in these countries to actually become more powerful. And I think that's why you see things like what I'm about to show. I mean, this is another article that you recently wrote. Latin America, it's called Latin America Refuses to Send Ukraine Weapons despite Western pressure. And then the subheading is Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia have refused to send weapons to Ukraine despite pressure by the US and EU. Latin American left-wing leaders have urged peace with Russia and called for neutrality in the West's new Cold War. So I think this is pretty significant because there's a few things going on here. On the one hand, you have these new left-leaning leaders who are able, they literally have space to forge an independent policy, like of their own, independent of US pressure and US interests, which is a big deal. And they're able to do that because of their important relationship with large countries with huge economies like Russia and China. And on top of that, it makes these countries, because of their desire to maintain a good relationship with countries like Russia and China, it basically gives these countries reduces the ability of the US to pressure these countries. So now these countries will no longer act as clients or puppets of the US war machine around the world. I'd like to get your take on the significance of the fact that these Latin American countries are refusing to take a very material position on the side of the US in this war, this proxy war in Ukraine.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll respond to that briefly, and then I also want to respond to your point about what imperialism is and why China and Russia are not imperialist. So just briefly in response to the point about Ukraine, we've seen that the US has been going around the world pressuring countries to join this new Cold War on Russia. And according to two former US diplomats writing in Newsweek, they admitted that 87% of the world's population lives in countries that have refused to join the new Cold War in Russia. And those are almost all in the global south. because the only countries outside of the so-called West, outside of the US and Europe, the only other countries that joined with the sanctions on Russia were Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan. And of course, South Korea and Japan are militarily occupied by the US and have been since the 40s or 50s. Excluding them, all other countries in the world are either neutral or, in some cases, openly on the side of Russia. In the case of Latin America, there is no country, not a single country, that is openly supporting Ukraine and NATO against Russia. They're either all neutral, even the right-wing governments, by the way, or they are, well, let me take that back. There are countries that have denounced Russia, some of the right-wing governments, specifically Ecuador, Costa Rica, and Chile. Chile is technically not right-wing, but it might as well be. I mean, it has this millennial anarchist president who basically has formed, he's like an NGO anarchist who condemns so-called authoritarianism everywhere except in the Western authoritarian regimes. But anyway, the point is that excluding the right-wing governments in Ecuador and Costa Rica and whatever you want to call it in Chile, every other country in the region has been completely neutral. And even Chile, for instance, they're not sending weapons to Ukraine, despite the fact that they're rhetorically criticizing Russia. They're not in any way helping NATO. In Ecuador, it's the same. Ecuador has an odious right-wing billionaire banker president, Guillermo Lasso. He's not sending weapons to Ukraine. In fact, he's continuing to do business with Russia. So it's these countries in the region, even the conservative leaders, recognize that it's not in their interest to get involved in this conflict they have nothing to do with.
Right.
And especially the left-wing leaders, not only are they neutral, many of them have been criticizing NATO. So in the case of, obviously, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, which have revolutionary governments, they've all condemned NATO, and they've all released statements saying that NATO bears responsibility for this war. Furthermore, the other left-wing governments in Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Bolivia, and also Honduras, they've all released statements saying that they oppose the war, and they've all proposed negotiating peace. Mexico's president, López Obrador, he has actually been working with the UN and even the Pope Francis, and he said that Mexico will sponsor peace talks like Turkey tried to do, So not only are they calling for peace, they are actively involved in trying to negotiate an end to this war. Brazil is, of course, part of the BRICS system, and President Lula, even before he became president, he did an interview with Time magazine, which was, Time was trying to provoke him into condemning Russia and just, doing what Time magazine always does as a mouthpiece of the U.S. State Department. And he refused to do so. And in fact, in that interview, during his presidential campaign, Lula said that Zelensky bears just as much responsibility for this war as Putin. He says, Zelensky is this actor who's trying to bring us to World War III and trying to drag everyone into this conflict instead of supporting peace. And he, now that he's president, Brazil has also on the international stage called for hosting peace talks and pushing for peace. So, I mean, the point is that not only many of these countries neutral, they are actually playing an activist role in trying to bring an end to this conflict. And I mean, that's the complete opposite of what the U.S. wants for them, which is to send weapons. Yeah, go ahead. What were you going to say?
No, I was going to say, and then on that second note, I know you wanted to address the issue of Russia and China and whether their behavior in Latin America could be classified as imperialist.
Yeah, I mean, we have to understand what imperialism means, right? Because oftentimes in the U.S., imperialism is thrown around, especially by people who support U.S. imperialism. Mm-hmm. They'll say that, Iran providing military support to Syria to prevent state collapse and to help the Syrian people prevent their government from being destroyed by foreign imperialists, they call that Iranian imperialism, which is insane. I mean, meanwhile, the U.S. and European Union and Israel and Gulf regimes and Turkey are flooding the country with weapons and training, Salafi forces, whatever. The point is that in Latin America, it's similar. The U.S. imperialists who have invaded Latin American countries dozens of times, militarily occupied them, overthrown their governments, organized coups, imposed sanctions. They're accusing China and Russia of so-called imperialism for having bilateral consensual relations with these countries that are mutually beneficial for them. And I mean, all we have to look is imperialism is about a few things. First of all, it's about extraction of value. Specifically, it's about the super exploitation of workers in the region to exploit their surplus value. It's also about controlling markets. There's a variety of things. But I mean, so first of all, when you have a crisis of overproduction in capitalism in the countries in the imperial core, you have these companies that produce all of these goods, but because they want to minimize the wages they pay to workers, they have to find foreign markets abroad to send those products to, because if they raise the wages of their workers, then their workers could buy those products, but then they might lose profits. So they want to instead sell the overproduction of those profits to foreign markets. So it's about destroying industries in other countries in the periphery to prevent those countries from having their own domestic industry, so they're reliant on goods from the imperial core. That's exactly what the US has done to Latin America, deindustrializing Latin America. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, at the peak of the kind of Keynesian moment when there were a lot of protectionist policies and what is known as import substitution industrialization, countries in Latin America like Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, they had significant industries. They produced technology. Brazil used to produce, in fact, the top Brazilian export, at least in terms of nominal exports in terms of dollars, the top Brazilian export used to be planes. Brazil had a massive state-owned plane company. Brazil produced military equipment. Brazil produced other technologies. The same for Mexico. Now, their top exports are raw materials, minerals, and agriculture. That's not going to help them develop. It's all about keeping these countries underdeveloped, and they export raw materials, and they are technologically reliant on the imperial core. And this is the point that, Rania, you've done great interviews with the Patnaiks, Oza Patnaik and Prabha Patnaik. This is also what they've emphasized, that the countries in the periphery largely are tropical countries that can produce crops 2 or 3 times per year. And unlike in the countries that are the temperate countries, which tend to be the imperial core, like the US and Europe, so they extract the agriculture and raw materials from these countries and prevent them from developing their own industries. That's not what China and Russia are doing. In fact, China is doing literally the exact opposite. China is working with some of these countries to try to develop local industry, and doing it in a mutually beneficial way. It's working with Bolivia to help develop its lithium industry. So, I mean, even according to, if we understand what imperialism is about, it's about creating dependencies. And we see this with Haiti as a classic example. Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. It is extremely poor. The poverty is brutal. What did the Clinton administration do? It made Haiti dependent on U.S. Rice exports. So not only is it about destroying local industry, it's about destroying local agriculture.
Right.
Haiti used to produce its own food. Now it's importing food, which is like this GMO monstrosity. It's like not even fit for human consumption, from U.S. agricultural exporters, which, by the way, are subsidized by the U.S. state. So, I mean, everywhere you look, it's about de-development. And if you look at these countries, the reason they want to improve their relations with China is because China is helping them to develop.
And I want to point something out. I mean, this is tangentially related, but it's like we have to touch on this because it was so hilarious. And I know it's a little bit dated at this point, but there's this crazy graph that came out. You wrote about it, Ben. For those who are just listening, so the headline here is "Exaggerating China's Military Spending. St. Louis Fed breaks all statistical rules with misleading graph." And here's the graph. I mean, this is going to be kind of hard to explain for those who can't see it. But for those who can see it, basically, this is a graph that's comparing the increase in military spending in different countries, including China, Russia, the UK, India, Saudi Arabia, and the US. Now, the weird thing about this graph is there's a right axis and a left axis of spending. And the right axis of this one right here, I believe, on the right, is billion. It's the billions of dollars, right? Starts at 400 billion and ends at $1 trillion. Well, the low and that on that axis is where we have the U.S.
Only
I'm sorry,
the
is
US.
where we have China.
Only the US is on
Only
that
the
axis.
U.S. I'm sorry, only the U.S. Literally, like the only. So if you look at the legend above, the U.S. is in blue and it says right axis, so that you know which side to look at for spending. Whereas every other country is on the left axis, which starts at $0 and goes up only to 300 billions. I mean, the reason I raised this, and I'm so glad that you actually wrote a piece about it, because most people were just like laughing about it on Twitter. So it's like documented somewhere, and I will share a link to it in the description. The reason this is so significant is that when we talk about imperialism, I mean, the most blatant kind of imperialism is the military spending, right? And the projection of military power around the world. And no one beats the US in that. But in order to make it seem like the US is on par, at least with like, not on par, at least to make it look like China is spending and doing more than the US, or is on par with the US on some level, they had to literally like manipulate the graph by creating these two axes.
Show the modified graph. Go down a little bit, and you can see when you edit it, and you'll see what it actually looks like when it's using the same consistent y-axis.
Okay, so again, here's the graph that they tweeted out, the manipulated graph. And by the way, for those who are watching, like the US is this one in the blue. So it actually, and then China's in the red. So this graph is so misleading. It makes it look like that China is spending significantly more on the military than the US, when actually it's the opposite.
The US spends 3 times as much. Yeah. 3 times as much. And if you do per capita spending, it's just off the charts.
And here's the modified graph. Here's the modified graph with the US in blue, and this is where it should be if you use the same numbers on both. You don't have two separate axes. You use the same numbers for everybody and graph them the same. The US is way up here at the $800 billion mark. And then China's way down here. And so is all these other countries that are significantly, by the way, smaller than China. So we could even take this further. And if you made the graph about like spending per capita.
At the bottom, go to the bottom of the article, and I have a chart that shows military spending per capita. So for people who don't know, of course, per capita means per head. So military spending per capita is the total military spending in the country divided by the population. And if you look at US per capita military spending and Chinese per capita, the US spends 12 times more on its military per capita than China.
That's so wild. I just thought that was really, really worth like pointing out, because it's like the only way to even make these countries seem imperialist in the way that the US is to manipulate, like visually manipulate actual facts and numbers to mislead people. And that to me is just like hilarious.
Well, and look at this. Wait, go down a little bit to the chart where we were talking about per capita. There's a chart below it.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit more.
Right here.
And this shows military expenditure per capita. And this is in constant dollars, so this is adjusted for inflation.
And who's at the top?
And actually, people might not be surprised to hear that the world's largest military spender per capita in terms of the population is actually apartheid Israel.
Woo!
At $2,500 per person. The next biggest, although this data is old, so it might have changed, but the next biggest is the UAE. Mm-hmm. And then number 3 is the United States. But they're all on the same level. The US, in 2020, the US spent $2,300 per person on the military.
Yeah, and not only like to say that, but this chart that you have here, I don't see China on it. So China doesn't even like.
Yeah, I said in the article, go down. China's per capita military spending in that year was $175. That's 7% of per capita U.S. military spending. Russia's per capita military spending was $423, which is lower than Lithuania, Portugal, and Belgium.
These tiny little countries. And then again, like just to remind you, we're talking China's per capita, $175, Russia's $423, the United States, 2,000, and this is 2020, so it's gone up actually because military spending has gone up. But the United States is $2,351, and constantly going up, constantly increasing like every year.
Well, this is adjusted for inflation. So some years, to be a little fair, because of inflation, some years military spending goes down a little bit, but in the past year, they did a massive increase, which is bigger than inflation.
And on top of that, I mean, it's important to also remember, like, what we qualify as military expenditure isn't even everything that actually gets spent on the military, because there's so many covert operations taking place. And, like, not everything is in that yearly defense budget spending bill. is all I'm
Yeah,
saying.
these numbers are only according to the official Pentagon budget, but we all know that the Pentagon spends much more. And in fact, at the bottom of the article, I linked to a report that shows that the Pentagon has failed every single audit it has ever done. And the Pentagon has tens of trillions of dollars of unaccounted spending. So, I mean, we don't know how much the military actually spends. And if you go up to the other graph, it shows you, just according to the official military budget, U.S. military spending versus the next 9 largest military spenders combined. And keep in mind, many of those are allies. India is an ally, and it's part of the Quad, which is the anti-China NATO. The UK is obviously an ally. It's like the little running dog of the U.S. empire.
Yeah.
France and Germany and Saudi Arabia and Japan and South Korea are all U.S. allies. So the only countries on there that are not U.S. allies are China and Russia. But all the other countries, if you combine their military spending, it's half of what the U.S. spends.
And yeah, I mean, in some ways, you could even make the argument that those countries are actually extensions of the U.S. of U.S. military. Like you could almost add that into, because like you said, I mean, these are all allies of the U.S., so their defense spending technically benefits the United States in many ways because they act as like little police in their regions of the world.
Yeah, Ronnie, I want to make one other quick point before we
Please.
move away from this. Actually, 2 quick points. One, where was this study from? If you go up to the tweet, this study was from the U.S. Federal Reserve. So to the tweet from the St. Louis Fed. So for people who don't know, the Federal Reserve is the semi-private central bank of the United States, and it was created in 1913 to take economic power away from the Treasury, which is part of the government and technically has democratic control over it, and basically to privatize it. And the Fed, it's mostly based in New York, but there are a dozen different smaller Feds across the country. And this is from the St. Louis Fed. What is the official stated mission of the Federal Reserve? Its stated mission is to maintain monetary stability, to keep inflation low. That's its only mission. That's what it's supposed to be doing. Instead, it's doing these reports about Chinese military spending. I mean, this is not part of the Fed's ostensible mission. And this is the key core tenet of neoliberal ideology, is that the Federal Reserve the central bank should be independent. And you hear all these libertarians, they're like, end the Fed. They mean they want to completely privatize the central bank. That's ridiculous. No, we should assert national democratic control over the Federal Reserve. It should be democratically accountable, not run by a bunch of bankers who are only acting in the interest of the 1%, of rich capitalists and the private banks. No. I mean, and it shows how they also feed into this new Cold War hysteria. And the other quick point I wanted to make about this is that they admit in this report, as biased as it is, they admit that although China's military spending in nominal terms and adjusted for inflation has increased, it has been completely consistent with the increase in the growth of the Chinese economy. That is GDP. The GDP is the size of the entire Chinese economy. They admit that year on year, Chinese military spending adjusted for GDP has been completely consistent since the early 1990s. And in fact, it has decreased since the 1990s. So Chinese military spending, it looks like it's doing this massive increase, but it's completely proportionate to the rise in the size of the Chinese economy. So what that graph really shows is that the Chinese economy has massively increased in size in the past 30 years, and the military growth has been completely proportionate to its increase in the GDP.
So those are all really, really important points. And there's actually, I love this conversation so much, Ben. I could talk to you for so long, but for the sake of, as you know, people's attention spans aren't as long as we'd like them to be. So we have to split it up into smaller doses. So I just have one more question that I actually want to ask you about. And this is something that you and I have discussed before. And I love your explanation for this. I know that there's people at the Geopolitical Economy Report who discuss this stuff a lot, but you condense it in such a nice way. I want to ask you, when we talk about this new Cold War, I've often not made the argument, but it does seem to me that when we think about the original Cold War, that was much more ideological, at least on the surface, right? Where you had this capitalist sort of Western bloc of countries led by the US empire following World War II versus this socialist bloc, and as well as like non-aligned countries, kind of, but this socialist bloc of countries led by the Soviet Union. So it at least seemed like, and it was in many ways, this very ideological economic battle between socialism and capitalism. Whereas today's Cold War is a little bit more nuanced than that, where you do have, obviously you still have US led global finance capital on the one side, US empire on the one side, but it's not necessarily versus socialism or a different economic ideology because, well, we can argue China's a socialist country, right? We can argue Cuba's a socialist country. Venezuela's a socialist country. There are other countries in this sort of group of, the axis of resistance, if you want to call it that, or the axis of evil, as the US might call it, axis of authoritarianism, whatever, that aren't socialist in any way whatsoever. I mean, you have Russia, which is a capitalist country. Iran is like, I don't know, I guess we could kind of talk about Iran's economy as kind of like a democratic socialism, maybe, but it has some capitalist elements. Syria, certainly not exactly like a socialist country, especially after all of these sanctions that have destroyed its economy and led to like a much more, unfortunately, corrupt and oligarchic system there. And I could go on, but I guess that brings me to my question of, what is the sort of ideological basis then of this new Cold War about? Because you have made the argument, others have made the argument that it is in fact some kind of economic ideology that, in the competition with each other at its core. So can you describe it as you see it?
Yeah, well, I'll give credit here to the economist Michael Hudson because he's the one that has really influenced my view on this, and he's got a really good book precisely about this topic, which is called The Destiny of Civilization. And he's a leftist economist, and he's often pointed out that we have to have a better understanding of capitalism and socialism, right? Because not all forms of capitalism are exactly the same. And I'm not saying that, capitalism is the good ideal system for humanity. I mean, I do think that humanity will move towards socialism, but we need to understand that there are differences between the 19th century understanding when you read, Adam Smith, who's been completely misrepresented, right? When they're talking about industrial capitalism, which is based on industrial production, and financialized neoliberal capitalism. I mean, obviously they're both capitalism and they both have problems, but financialized neoliberal capitalism is actually fundamentally different because it's not based on production. It's based on debt and finance. It's not based on producing products for a consumer economy and a market, right? Like China has a market socialist system. So it has state control of the commanding heights of the economy, of the land, of the banking sector, which is very important. The banking sector is owned by the state, telecommunications, infrastructure, but it has a market system. And there are companies that exist within that market that exist in a kind of industrial capitalist model, although the state maintains state control toward a socialist, in a socialist direction, right? But the finance sector is run by the state. The state runs the finance sector, whereas in the US, the finance sector runs the state. You look at every single presidential candidate, senatorial candidate, they're all funded not only by the big companies, but by the big banks, which dominate the system. They're so powerful that they're too big to fail. They're so powerful that the US government prints trillions of dollars to bail out the private banks because the entire economy would be crushed. It would implode without those private banks. The point Michael Hudson has argued, and I think he's absolutely right about this, is that what we're seeing in this new Cold War is a war waged by the US-led neoliberal financialized order against a mix of socialism, but also industrial capitalism. And Russia's an example of this. I mean, Russia's certainly not a socialist model, but the Russian economic model is not the exact same as the Western neoliberal financialized model. The Russian economic model is still largely based on production, not financialization. In fact, some of the largest banks in Russia are owned by the state. Can you imagine the US government nationalizing Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan Chase? Russia's Sberbank, which is the largest bank in the country, is owned by the state. Russia, can you imagine the US government nationalizing Exxon or Chevron? Russia's largest company in the entire economy is the gas giant, Gazprom, which is owned by the state. And it's responsible for a huge percentage of exports. So the point is that, I mean, that model used to be much more common before the neoliberal era. There were a lot of mixed economies, right?
Right.
Where they have significant state control. You mentioned Iran. Iran is an example of this. Iran actually has very significant state control over the economy. I wouldn't say it's socialist, but it's a mixed economy, and it's a developmentalist national economy that is they act on the interest of their own national economy and national population. And that's what we're seeing and then we see this right now happening in Europe. The US is deindustrializing its so-called allies in Europe. So the thing is, finance capital is completely parasitic. It doesn't lead to production. It destroys production. Look at the United States, the world's largest owner of commercial real estate. In fact, in history, it's BlackRock. They don't produce anything. It's parasitic financial capital. And by the very nature of how finance capital works, because what is finance? What does the financial industry produce? It produces debt. Mm-hmm. It's all based on debt. And debt grows at a compound interest faster than the real economy grows. So the finance sector is literally a parasite. It grows faster than the actual industrial sector. And that's why if you look at the US economy and certain Western European economies, you see a growing tendency toward more and more finance and less production.
And like, also, if you think, even just consider like, what does the US produce versus what do countries like Russia and China produce? The US produces tech giants, like social media companies. And the US produces all these like weird financial instruments to like speculate and make a ton of more money. Whereas China and Russia produce actual things that you need to survive. Like they have raw commodities. Russia has natural gas, has fertilizer, and all kinds of other things. China, of course, like has a huge labor force and produces all kinds of products and parts that go into the machines that we need to make the world function, like all around the world. So it really does show that the longer that time goes by, like it's like the US is really in this decayed mode of capitalism. And I think COVID, that brief period where like COVID made it more difficult to trade things because everybody was scared of getting each other sick. You saw just how fragile these countries in the global north actually are because they don't really produce anything. They rely on what they steal from other parts of the world. Anyways, Ben, I want to thank you for joining me for the hour and breaking all this down. These are such important topics to understand. I want you to give everybody an idea of where they can find all of your incredible work.
Well, thank you, Rania. People can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com. It's all there. And I won't plug my work. I'll plug a show that launched recently that I've been producing and publishing, which is at Geopolitical Economy Report. I've been expanding it a bit and trying to bring in more contributors. And I mentioned the economist Michael Hudson, and another brilliant Marxist and economist who has been doing a lot of work on this is Radhika Desai. And she has a show with Michael Hudson that's called Geopolitical Economy Hour. And every 2 weeks, they publish an episode for an hour discussing these exact same issues that we've been talking about today. And they're going to be doing an episode on de-dollarization. They did one on inflation. So what I've been trying to do with this work is combine geopolitical analysis of the world and understanding imperialism, but also with an economic understanding, a materialist understanding, because we need to understand the inner workings of capitalism in order to eventually transcend it. But we also can't understand imperialism without that economic element. So Ronnie, I really want to thank you for having me, and thank you for the work that you do. I mean, you all at Breakthrough have been doing something very similar. I mean, your work has been awesome with your show, also with the streams that you do with Eugene. And you're one of the only people I know who will have on people to talk about these topics, like I mentioned the Patnaik. So everyone should also check out Rania's interview with Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik, where they talk about imperialism, because that's how we can understand the system better to fight against it.
Absolutely. Well, the admiration and respect is 100% mutual, as anybody who watches us knows. We're also very good friends, so it's always really a pleasure to get to catch up with you. Ben, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to see more progressive anti-imperialist content like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with the latest breakthrough news content. And if you want to support our work and get access to exclusive content, head over to patreon.com/breakthroughnews.